Chapter 1. The First Refusal. The impulse began before history had a name. It was born in the first moment. A grieving human looked upon a motionless kin and refused to accept the finality of the rot. Death was a messy, smelling thing, an affront to the memory of the vibrant living, and the earliest instinct was not merely to hide the body away, but to stop the horrific process of dissolution that turned a loved one into monster. We begin where the earth itself conspired to aid this refusal, the Atacama Desert, a ribbon of hyper-arid land stretching along the Pacific coast of South America. Here, thousands of years before the pyramids rose along the Nile, the Chinchorro people lived a precarious existence caught between the bounty of the ocean and the absolute sterility of the sands. In this landscape, nothing ever truly decayed, but a fish thrown onto the beach would stiffen into a salty shard of leather in days. The Chinchorro observed this. They saw that nature had a way of pausing time, and they sought to emulate it, not out of grandeur, but out of a desperate, visceral need to keep their community intact. The earliest attempts were crude, born of trauma. A child would die. Mortality was high in these harsh coastal settlements, and the mother, unable to part with the small body, would wrap it in pelican skins and reeds. The intense dryness did the rest, but natural desiccation was imperfect. The abdomen would bloat. The features would collapse into an unrecognizable grimace. The Chinchorro wanted more. They wanted the dead to remain present, to be permanent fixtures in the tents of the living. And so, around 7,000 years ago, they began the sacred, horrifying work of artificial preservation. It was a ritual born of love that required the stomach of a butcher. Imagine the scene under the relentless Atacama sun. The community gathers. The body of an adult male, perhaps a revered fisherman, lies on a mat of woven rushes. The grieving period has passed its initial wailing peak. Now is the time for the artisans of death to begin their grim craft. They are not priests in high robes, but skilled technicians, their hands calloused from scaling fish and knapping stone. Their tools are shards of sharp obsidian and sea lion rib bones honed to a fine edge. The process was an act of complete dismantling. They believed that the wetness of life was the enemy of eternity. To save the man, they had to destroy him first. With practiced, somber precision, they began to peel the skin from the body, flaying the corpse in large sections, struggling to keep the human pelt intact. Once the skin was removed and set aside like a discarded garment, the true excavation began. They cut away the muscle, the fat, the viscera. They scraped the bones clean until a human skeleton lay gleaming white against the dark sand. The brain, that watery seat of consciousness, was deemed unnecessary for the afterlife they envisioned. It was extracted through the base of the skull or by smashing the face, pulled out in gobbets with hooked sticks. What remained was a blueprint of a human being. But they did not stop there. The bones, now free of their connective tissue, would rattle and collapse. To create an eternal ancestor, they needed structure. They gathered long, sturdy sticks and lashed them to the spine, the femurs, and the arms with cords made of vegetable fiber. They were building a statue, using the deceased's own skeleton as the armature. Once the frame was rigid, the reconstruction commenced. They mixed a paste of gray ash, water, and a binder, perhaps sea lion oil or egg. With this clay-like substance, they began to re-sculpt the body over the bone and stick frame. They modeled calves, thighs, a torso, smoothing the gray paste with their thumbs, recreating the volume of the man they had known. Then came the most delicate task, the return of the skin. The flayed hide, now dried and stiff, was fitted back over the ash mannequin. It rarely fit perfectly. It had to be stretched, patched with pieces of sea lion skin, and sewn together with coarse twine. The result was a rigid, gray-skinned effigy, a human doll that smelled of ash and dried brine. The face received special attention. The original face was gone, lost in the flaying. Instead, they fashioned a mask of black manganese clay. It was a stylized visage, round eyes drilled into the clay, a small O-shaped mouth, a simple nose. It was not a portrait of the man, but a portrait of death itself, serene and unchanging. On the scalp, they pasted thick tufts of human hair, sometimes his own, sometimes donated by kin, creating a dark halo around the black mask. These black mummies of the Chinchorro were not hidden in dark tombs. They were painted with brilliant red ochre and stood upright in the sand, propped against the walls of the shelters. They remained part of the family. They were taken out for rituals, perhaps even fed symbolically. The creepy genius of the Chinchorro was their willingness to endure the horrific process of disassembly to achieve a permanent, tangible ancestor. They did not fear the dead body. They feared its absence. They turned their loved ones into statues so they would never have to say goodbye. Chapter 2. The Black Sands of Arica. As centuries bled into millennia along the Atacama coast, the techniques of the Chinchorro evolved, shifting in style, but never losing that core, unsettling commitment to physical reconstruction. The climate remained their steadfast ally. In the valleys near modern-day Arica, Chile, the dead continued to accumulate layers of dried history buried in the hyper-arid earth. The Black Mummy phase, with its total disassembly and manganese masks, eventually gave way to the Red Mummy tradition. The shift was aesthetic, but the underlying violence of preservation remained. The focus moved from internal reconstruction to external rigidity. In this later era, the treatment became less invasive, but perhaps more grotesque in its appearance. Instead of flaying the entire body, the artisans of Arica focused on the trunk and head. They made incisions in the abdomen and shoulders, pulling out the internal organs and the brain through relatively small openings. The body cavity was then rinsed with seawater, a purifying baptism of brine. But a hollow body collapses. To maintain the human shape, the Chinchorro stuffed the cavities with whatever was at hand: feathers, dried grass, shells, and colored earth. They packed the chest until it was rigid and barrel-shaped. To keep the head upright, they inserted a long, pointed stick down through the top of the skull, driving it deep into the spinal canal of the neck and torso. The deceased was literally impaled on a structural stake to ensure good posture in eternity. The most striking feature of the red mummies was the surface treatment. The entire body, as now stiff and stuffed, was painted with a thick slurry of red ochre. The head was often adorned with a long, flowing wig made of human hair, sometimes dyed red as well. The face remained a mask, but now it was often painted in stripes of red and black, mouth open in a silent, eternal cry. These bodies were buried in groups, extended families lying side by side in shallow pits. Because the desert sands shift, it was not uncommon for later generations to accidentally uncover their ancestors, the site of a 1,000-year-old relative. their red-painted skin leathery and taut, their hair perfectly preserved, must have reinforced the belief that they had conquered death. The dead were not gone. They were just sleeping beneath a thin blanket of dust. There is an intimacy to the Chinchorro method that is deeply disturbing to the modern sensibility. This was not a clinical process performed behind closed doors by specialized professionals. This was a community act. The tools found in the graves, the stone knives, the bone needles, the paint pots, suggest that many people were involved in the preparation. Children were mummified with the same elaborate care as adults, perhaps even more. The tiny, stick-reinforced bodies of infants, their faces covered in miniature clay masks, are among the most poignant and heart-wrenching archaeological finds on Earth. They speak of a grief so profound that parents would spend weeks dissecting and rebuilding their dead child rather than let the earth take them. The Chinchorro culture eventually faded, absorbed by later Andean groups, but they set a precedent. They were the pioneers of the macabre, the first to decide that the human form was something that could be engineered, stabilized, and kept. They proved that with enough effort and enough stomach for the visceral reality of the corpse, the dead could be made to linger. Chapter 3. The Golden House of Eternity. Thousands of miles away, across an ocean and a continent, another civilization was arriving at the same conclusion, though through a vastly different cultural lens. In the fertile ribbon of the Nile Valley, the Egyptians were beginning their own long obsession with the denial of decay. Unlike the egalitarian Chinchorro, where everyone was mummified, Egyptian preservation began as a royal prerogative, a magical technology reserved for the god-kings who needed their physical vessels to retain their souls, the Ka and the Ba, in the afterlife. Before the Great Pyramids rose, the earliest Egyptians were buried like the Chinchorro, in simple pits in the hot sand. The desert did its work, producing natural mummies, shriveled, leathery corpses with skin pulled tight over bone, curled in a fetal position. But as Egyptian society became more stratified, the elite demanded more elaborate tombs. They built mastabas, rectangular mud brick structures that sealed the body away from the elements. Crucially, this led to a problem. By isolating the body in a cool, damp tomb away from the drying sand, they inadvertently accelerated decay. The bodies of the early pharaohs rotted within their expensive sepulchres. The Egyptians were horrified. If the body perished, the soul was untethered, doomed to cease existing. They had to invent a way to do artificially what the desert had done naturally. They had to invent embalming. The early dynasties were a period of gruesome experimentation. They tried wrapping the bodies tightly in linen, soaked in resin, creating a hard shell, but the flesh inside still putrefied, leaving only a jumble of bones within a resin cast. They tried defleshing the bones and reassembling them similar to the Chinchorro, but this felt disrespectful to the royal person. Slowly, through trial and error over centuries, a specialized class of priests evolved, the embalmers. They worked in the Wabet, the place of purification, usually situated on the west bank of the Nile, the land of the setting sun and the dead. It was a place of profound spiritual significance, but physically, it was an abattoir. The air around the Wabet was heavy with complex, cloying smells. The sharp tang of natron salt, the sweet smoke of juniper and cedar incense meant to mask the odor of death. the metallic scent of blood, and the underlying sickly sweet stench of human dissolution that no amount of perfume could entirely hide. The embalmers were not just technicians, they were ritualists, playing the role of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. The chief embalmer would often wear a jackal mask during the most critical moments of the process, channeling the divine energy necessary to transfigure a corpse into an ak, a glorified spirit. By the time of the New Kingdom, the process had become a rigid 70-day liturgy of preservation. When a high-ranking Egyptian died, their body was brought to the waybit amid the wailing of professional mourners. The first step was the most intrusive, a violation of the body's sanctity necessary to save it. The embalmers knew that decay started from within, in the soft, moist organs of the abdomen and the mysterious pulp inside the skull. These had to go. The brain presented a unique challenge. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion. The brain was merely a producer of mucus, unimportant for the afterlife. Yet, if left inside, it would rot and destroy the head. They couldn't cut open the skull, as that would damage the face, the crucial marker of identity. The solution was ingenious and barbaric. They utilized a long bronze or copper hook. The embalmer would insert this instrument up the deceased's nostril, hammering it through the thin ethmoid bone that separates the nasal cavity from the brain case. Once inside, the hook was rotated and whipped around, churning the brain matter into a semi-liquid mush. The body was then turned onto its face, and the liquefied brain was allowed to drain out through the nostrils, collected in a bowl and typically buried near the tomb. What remained inside the skull was rinsed out with dissolved drugs and palm wine. To prevent the skull from collapsing over time, they would sometimes pour hot resin into the cranial cavity, which would solidify as it cooled, coating the inside of the skull with a black, glassy preservative layer. This was only the beginning of the violation. The body, now devoid of its thinking apparatus, was ready for the evisceration of the torso, the next stage in its transformation from a cooling corpse into a golden vessel for eternity. Chapter 4. The 70-Day Hook. The Wabet was a place of blood and shadows, lit by flickering oil lamps that cast long, dancing shapes against the mud brick walls. The heat of Egypt did not stop at the door. The air inside was stifling, thick with the humidity of the nearby Nile and the evaporating fluids of the dead. With the brain removed, the embalmers turned their attention to the torso. The chief embalmer, wearing his jackal mask, made a precise incision on the left side of the abdomen using a ritual blade made of Ethiopian obsidian, a nod to older Stone Age traditions, even in the Bronze Age. Through this relatively small slit, the embalmer's hand, slick with oils, reached inside the human cavity. It was a gruesome task requiring knowledge of anatomy that few possessed. One by one, the organs were severed from their connective tissues and pulled out through the incision. The stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs, the parts most prone to rapid putrefaction, were removed. Great care was taken to leave the heart in place. The heart, the ib, was the center of the being, the record of all a person's deeds. It would be kneaded in the hall of Ma'at, where it would be weighed against the feather of truth. If the heart was accidentally removed, it had to be sewn back in or replaced with a stone scarab beetle amulet inscribed with a spell to act as its proxy. The kidneys considered less important, were often left inside, ignored, in the depths of the back cavity. The removed organs were not discarded. They were integral parts of the deceased, sharing in their divine destiny. Each organ was washed in palm wine and dusted with spices, then individually wrapped in linen. They were placed in 4 special containers known as canopic jars. These jars were often capped with heads representing the 4 sons of Horus, guardians of the viscera. Imseti, the human-headed, protected the liver. Happy, the baboon-headed, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, the jackal-headed, watched over the stomach. And Kebesenuef, the falcon-headed, looked after the intestines. These jars would stand sentinel in the tomb close to the sarcophagus. Now, the body was an empty husk, a cavity of ribs and spine. It needed to be dried out completely, or all this work would be in vain. The Egyptians did not use heat. They used chemistry. They had discovered natron, a naturally occurring compound of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate found in dry lake beds near the Nile. Natron was a supreme desiccant and a mild antiseptic. The embalmers did not sprinkle a little salt on the body. They submerged it. They took hundreds of pounds of powdered natron and stuffed the empty body cavities full of it. Then they piled more natron over the entire corpse until it was completely buried in a white mound on the embalming table. For 40 days, the body lay under this mountain of salt. It was a slow, passive violence. The natron leached every drop of moisture from the flesh. The body fats dissolved. The muscles shrank and darkened. The skin became thin, hard, and leathery, clinging tightly to the bones. The corpse lost up to 75% of its weight. When the 40 days were up, the embalmers excavated the body from the salt. What emerged was no longer recognizable as the soft, yielding person who had died. It was a rigid, blackened, shriveled thing, durable as dry wood. The natron had stopped the rot, but it had taken the humanity with it. The cavity was emptied of the salt packets and washed out again with aromatic spices and wine to remove the smell of the desiccation process. Now the embalmers had to restore the semblance of life to this dried husk. They stuffed the body again, this time not with salt, but with materials meant to remain forever. Sawdust, linen scraps soaked in resin, dried lichen, and bags of cinnamon and myrrh. They packed the cheeks to reduce the gaunt look and sometimes placed balls of linen under the eyelids to replace the shrunken eyes. The abdominal incision was sewn shut, or sometimes covered with a wax or gold plate bearing the eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of healing and protection, sealing the sacred vessel. The skin, now dark and brittle, was massaged with oils and beeswax. Perfumes of cedar and juniper rubbed into the leathery surface in an attempt to bring back a kind of suppleness, to make it smell not of death, but of the gods. The body was now a stable, enduring object, ready for the final transformation into a mummy. Chapter 5. The Wrapped Cocoon. The drying was complete. The wrapping began. This was not merely covering the body. It was a ritual act of binding, of creating a magical cocoon that would protect the deceased during their perilous journey through the Duat, the underworld. The linen used was often recycled from old clothing or household textiles, representing the continuity of life. Yards upon yards of fabric were torn into strips of varying widths. The process was slow and methodical, accompanied by the recitation of spells from the Book of the Dead by a lector priest. Every winding had a meaning. Every knot was a magical seal. They began with the extremities. Each finger and toe was wrapped individually in fine linen strips. It was delicate, tedious work to bind the tiny, shriveled digits without breaking them. Then the hands were wrapped. Then the arms, usually folded across the chest in the Osiris pose of kingship and submission to the divine. The head was wrapped with particular care, maintaining the shape of the face. Sometimes a portrait mask made of cartonnage, layers of linen or papyrus soaked in plaster, similar to papier-mâché, was fitted over the wrapped face. For pharaohs, this mask would be of beaten gold, an imperishable copy of their living features intended to help the soul recognize its body. As the layers of linen built up, the embalmers inserted amulets between the wrappings. These were small charms of faience, stone or gold, each holding specific protective powers. A heart scarab was placed over the chest, an Ankh symbol for life, a Jed pillar for stability, and an Ujjat eye for health were tucked into the folds. But a high-ranking mummy might have hundreds of these magical batteries hidden within their linen cocoon, forming a spiritual armor against the demons and serpents they would face in the afterlife. Molten resin, smelling sharp and piney, was painted over the layers to glue them together, creating a hard, waterproof carapace. The final result was a streamlined, somewhat abstract human form, rigid and heavy with resin and cloth. The vulnerability of the naked corpse was gone, replaced by an armored shape ready for eternity. The culmination of the 70-day process was the funeral procession and the opening of the mouth ceremony performed at the tomb entrance. The mummy stood upright, supported by a priest wearing the jackal mask of Anubis. Another priest, usually the son and heir of the deceased, used special ritual tools and adze made of meteoric iron and a chisel shaped like a fishtail to magically touch the eyes and mouth of the mummy case or mask. Spells were chanted, "My mouth is opened by Ptah. My mouth's bonds are loosed by my city god. Thoth has come fully equipped with magic. He looses the bonds of Seth, which restricted my mouth." The purpose was terrifyingly literal in its intent. They were magically reactivating the senses of the corpse. They believed that by touching the mask with these tools, the mummy inside would regain the ability to see, hear, smell, and consume the food offerings that would be brought to the tomb. It was the final act of reanimation, turning the preserved object back into a sentient, albeit passive, being. Once activated, the mummy was sealed in its series of nested coffins, wooden cases painted with complex theological diagrams and gods, and finally placed in the heavy stone sarcophagus deep within the tomb chamber. The door was sealed, the offerings made, and the living walked away, hoping their magic was strong enough. The Egyptian method was a triumph of ritual over biology. They didn't just want to keep the body, they wanted to keep the person. They fought rot with salt, emptiness with sawdust, and silence with magic words, creating a civilization that lived in the shadow of its own magnificent, chemically stabilized dead. Chapter 6. The Jade Armor. While the Egyptians were perfecting the art of desiccation under the desert sun halfway around the world during the Han Dynasty in China, a different philosophy of preservation was taking hold among the imperial elite. Their approach was less about chemically altering the flesh and more about encasing it in a material believed to possess inherent magical properties. Jade. To the ancient Chinese, jade, the yu, was more than just a beautiful stone. It was the physical manifestation of yang energy, the essence of life, heaven, and immortality. It was believed to have prophylactic qualities, capable of warding off decay and evil spirits. If gold was the flesh of the gods to the Egyptians, jade was the concentrated essence of life itself to the Chinese. The Han emperors and their high nobility took this belief to its logical, extreme conclusion. They did not seek to dry the body out. They sought to hermetically seal it inside a suit made entirely of this precious stone. The construction of a jade burial suit was an undertaking of immense cost and labor, requiring years of work by master craftsmen. These were not solid sarcophagi, but flexible suits of armor made from thousands of small, rectangular plaques of jade. Imagine the scene in the imperial workshops. The air rings with a high-pitched grind of abrasive sand and water against hard stone. Jade is notoriously difficult to work. It cannot be carved like marble, only abraded away slowly. Thousands of small plates had to be cut, ground to uniform thickness, and polished until they gleamed with a cool, translucent light. Once the plates were ready, the assembly began. Each small plaque had tiny holes drilled into its corners. The plates were then meticulously sewn together using wire. For an emperor, the wire was made of gold. For lesser princes or high officials, silver or copper wire was used. The suit was designed to fit the specific dimensions of the deceased, covering them completely from head to toe like a glittering, scaled second skin. A typical suit might contain 2,000 to 5,000 individual jade plaques and over a kilogram of gold wire. It was divided into sections: a helmet for the head, a jacket for the torso, trousers for the legs, and individual boots and gloves. When an emperor died, his body was washed and dressed in fine silks. Then, the heavy sections of the jade suit were carefully fitted over him. The helmet masked his face, leaving nothing exposed. The gloves covered his hands, the boots his feet. He was transformed into a shining mineral statue. But the external armor wasn't enough. The Han believed that the body had 9 apertures through which the vital essence, the Kwai, could leak out, accelerating decay. These holes had to be plugged. Jade plugs were inserted into the nostrils and ears. A jade cicada, symbol of rebirth because of its underground life cycle and emergence, was placed in the mouth, on the tongue. A large, often elaborately carved jade plug was inserted into the anus, and another into the genitals. The body was effectively sealed tight, both inside and out, by the magical stone. The theory was that the jade would trap the Qui inside the body, thus preventing the soul from dissipating and somehow halting the biological process of rotting through its sheer mystical power. They believed the stone's coolness and purity would transfer to the flesh beneath it. The reality, discovered by archaeologists thousands of years later, was grimly ironic. The jade suits, while magnificent works of art, were terrible preservatives. By sealing the body tightly within a stone cocoon, they trapped moisture and heat inside. Instead of preventing decay, the jade suits created a perfect microenvironment for anaerobic bacteria. When archaeologists opened these tombs, they found the jade suits intact, gleaming beautifully in the darkness. But inside the golden wired armor, there was often nothing left but a fine gray powder and a few collapsed bones. The emperors had been reduced to dust inside their magnificent shells. The magic of the stone had failed against the relentless biology of death, a billion-dollar effort that only succeeded in creating the world's most expensive pile of dust. Chapter 7. The Lady in the Mysterious Liquid. Yet, China is vast, and its ancient secrets are many. While the jade suits failed to preserve the flesh, another technique from roughly the same era succeeded to a degree that still baffles modern science. This was not the dry preservation of Egypt or the mineral encasement of the emperors. This was something wet, chemical, and profoundly strange. The revelation came in the 1970s near Changsha, with the discovery of the Mawangdui tombs. Inside tomb number 1 lay the body of Xin Jue, the Marquise of Dai, a noblewoman who died around 163 BC. When the archaeologists finally breached the innermost of her 4-nested lacquered coffins, they did not find dust or bones. They found a woman floating. Xin Jue's body was immersed in roughly 20 gallons of an unknown reddish-brown liquid. When she was carefully lifted from this bath, the scientists present were stunned. This was not a mummy in the Egyptian sense. She was not dried or stiff. She was soft. After more than 2,000 years, her skin was still supple and elastic to the touch. Her joints were flexible. Her arms and legs could be bent and moved without resistance. Her hair was intact, including the hair in her nostrils and her eyelashes. Even the intricate fingerprints on her hands were perfectly preserved. It was as if she had died only days before. The autopsy performed on Xin Jue was unprecedented. It was a modern medical examination of an ancient person. Doctors were able to draw blood from her veins. It was type A. They examined her internal organs, which were perfectly intact. They found she had suffered from heart disease, hypertension, and gallstones. They even found exactly what she had eaten for her last meal. Melon seeds were present in her stomach, indicating she died shortly after eating in the summer. How was this possible? The preservation seems to have been a combination of extreme environmental control and a mysterious chemical cocktail. Xin Jue was buried deep underground in a watertight tomb. Her nested coffins were encased in a massive layer of charcoal, which absorbed moisture, and surrounded by a thick layer of white kaolin clay, which sealed the entire structure hermetically, cutting off all oxygen. But the key was the reddish liquid. Its exact composition remained something of a mystery, as it changed over 2 millennia of interaction with the body. However, analysis suggests it contained mercury and various organic compounds that acted as potent antibacterial agents. Well, it was slightly acidic. Some theorists believe it might have been a type of herbal elixir intended to confer immortality, which the deceased drank or was bathed in. There were other similar finds in China, bodies so well preserved in fluid that they were termed wet mummies. They present a stark contrast to the dusty horrors of other cultures. Xin Jue does not look peaceful. Her face is swollen, and her tongue protrudes slightly, likely due to gas pressure early in the decomposition process before the preservation took full hold. She looks grotesque, but undeniably horrifyingly human. The Mawangdui method was a hyper-advanced chemical assault on decay, an attempt to pickle the human form in a bath of alchemical preservatives. It was an expensive, complex, and esoteric practice, likely reserved for the very few who had access to the highest levels of Taoist alchemical knowledge. It was a gamble that paid off, leaving us with a 2,000-year-old body that feels like it belongs to a sleeping grandmother, an unsettling testament to the ancient Chinese mastery of chemical preservation. Chapter 8. The Frozen Sleepers of the Steppe. Far to the north and west of China, On the vast, windswept grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, another culture faced death in a climate that offered a different kind of preservation. Extreme cold. The Scythians were horse-riding nomads, fierce warriors who dominated the steppes for centuries. They did not build cities or temples. Their wealth was on the hoof, and their lives were defined by movement. Yet, for their dead chieftains, they created elaborate underground chambers that served as deep freezes. In the high Altai mountains at places like Pazyryk, the Scythians buried their elite in massive log barrows called kurgans. They dug deep pits into the ground, defying the permafrost, and built chambers lined with larch logs. These tombs were covered with huge mounds of stones. The stones were crucial. They shaded the ground beneath them, preventing the summer sun from thawing the soil, effectively creating a permanent pocket of permafrost directly around the burial chamber. The preservation of the Pazyryk mummies was a mix of intentional embalming and accidental freezing. When a chieftain died, his body had to be displayed for weeks so that distant tribes could ride in to pay their respects. To prevent the body from rotting during this period, the Scythians performed basic embalming that echoed both Egyptian and Chinchorro techniques. They sliced open the body and removed the internal organs. They removed the brain, often by trepanning, cutting a hole directly into the skull. They also removed much of the muscle tissue from the arms and legs. To maintain the shape of the warrior, they stuffed the skin with a mixture of straw, larch needles, and cannabis seeds. The incisions were sewn up with horsehair thread. This initial treatment kept the body stable for the funeral rites, but the true preservation happened after burial. Once the body was placed in the log chamber, often resting in a hollowed-out log coffin that resembled a canoe, and the stone mound was raised above it, water would seep into the pit and freeze. The tomb became an ice block. When Soviet archaeologists excavated these kurgans in the 20th century, they had to pour boiling water over the contents to thaw them out. What emerged from the ice were some of the most spectacular mummies ever found. Because they were frozen, not dried, their skin retained a remarkable suppleness and color. But the most incredible detail preserved by the ice was their art. The Scythian chieftains were heavily tattooed. One prominent mummy, known as the Chieftain, had both arms covered in elaborate swirling blue tattoos of mythical beasts, griffins tearing at deer, strange feline creatures with antlers. The designs were dynamic, wrapping around his musculature, preserved perfectly in the frozen skin. These were not just decorations. They were marks of status, magical totems that he carried with him into the next world. Buried with them were their horses. In one tomb, over a dozen horses were found, slaughtered and arranged around the coffin. They too were frozen, their stomachs intact, containing their last meal of steppe grass, their ornate felt saddle blankets and bridal ornaments preserved in bright colors. The Scythian tombs were time capsules packed with cannabis braziers for ritual smoking, embroidered tapestries showing court scenes, and wooden furniture. They expected the afterlife to be a continuation of their life on the steppe, a place of feasting, riding, and warfare. The ice ensured that they arrived in the other world intact, their tattoos bright, their bodies ready to mount the frozen steeds that waited beside them. It was preservation by refrigeration, a testament to a culture that mastered its harsh environment even in death. Chapter 9. The Cloud Ancestors. In the high Andes of South America, the mountains themselves were gods. The peaks reaching into the thin air were the Apus, powerful spirits that controlled the weather, the water, and the fertility of the land below. To appease these immense powers, the Inca civilization practiced a form of preservation that was inextricable from sacrifice. This was the Capacocha ceremony, one of the most solemn and disturbingly poignant rituals in human history. When an Inca emperor needed to ensure the favor of the gods during a famine, the death of a ruler, or a natural disaster, they would select the most beautiful, unblemished children from across the empire. These children were not viewed as victims, but as divine messengers being sent to live with the gods. For months before the sacrifice, but the children were feted and treated like royalty. Then began the arduous procession up the mountains. They climbed to dizzying heights, often over 20,000 feet, to shrines built on the very summits of volcanoes like Ampato and Lulailaco. The preservation here was entirely natural, the result of the extreme environment at high altitude. The combination of freezing temperatures, incredibly dry air, and thin atmosphere blocked bacterial growth almost entirely. The reality of the sacrifice, however, was grim. As they reached the freezing summit, the children were given large amounts of chicha, corn beer, to intoxicate them, and coca leaves to chew to numb their senses against the cold and altitude sickness. Once heavily drugged and disoriented, they were placed in a small stone tomb pit. Some were killed instantly with a blow to the head. Others were simply left sitting in the pit, surrounded by offerings of miniature gold statues, fine textiles, and food, to fall asleep in the freezing cold and never wake up. The resulting mummies, discovered by high-altitude archaeologists in recent decades, are heartbreakingly lifelike. The most famous, the Maiden of Lulailaco, was a teenage girl found sitting cross-legged, her head slumped forward in sleep. She wears a fine alpaca tunic and a feathered headdress. Her face still holds the flush of her cheeks from the cold. Her tightly braided hair is intact. She looks for all the world like she is merely napping. Scientists analyzing her hair discovered a timeline of her last months, showing a massive spike in coca and alcohol ingestion in the weeks leading up to her death. She was kept in a semi-conscious state as she approached her divine fate. These children were not meant to rot. They were meant to become eternal guardians, sitting forever on the mountain peaks, watching over the Inca Empire. The Inca believed they did not die, but joined the realm of the Apus. Their perfectly frozen bodies were proof of their acceptance by the gods. It is a form of preservation born of immense spiritual need, where the innocence of a child was traded for the security of an empire, frozen forever in the thin, cold air between heaven and earth. Chapter 10. The Bundles of the Cliffside. Before the Inca dominated the Andes, and even during their reign in the rugged northern highlands of modern-day Peru, another mysterious culture practiced a distinct form of ancestral preservation designed to keep the dead visible, watching over the living from above. These were the Chachapoya, known as the Warriors of the Clouds. Their homeland was the high, humid cloud forests, a difficult environment for preserving organic material. Yet, their devotion to their ancestors drove them to develop unique methods. The Chachapoya did not bury their dead in the ground. They believed the ancestors needed to remain in the community's visual sphere, acting as guardians of territories and intermediaries with the gods of the sky and rain. To achieve this, they placed their dead on the faces of sheer or vertical cliffs that soared hundreds of feet above the valley floors. The preparation of the body was the first step. Like many Andean cultures, they practiced evisceration and desiccation. The bodies were treated with salts and herbs, smoked over fires, and then tightly flexed into a fetal position, knees drawn up to the chin. This compact bundle was then wrapped in layers of fine textiles, often embroidered with complex faces or geometric patterns. But the Chachapoya went further. They created rigid sarcophagi to house these bundles, known as purun machus. These were constructed on cliff ledges that were incredibly difficult to access, requiring scaffoldings and ropes that were likely dismantled afterward. The sarcophagi were human-shaped containers built around the mummy bundle using a frame of cane and covered with a thick layer of clay and mud mixed with straw. They stood up to 8 feet tall. The artisans then sculpted the clay into stylized human figures. They gave them prominent noses, square jaws, and sometimes added skulls, trophy heads to the exterior, perhaps indicating the warrior status of the deceased. The sarcophagi were painted in bold colors, reds, yellows, and whites, making them stand out starkly against the gray cliff rock. From the valley floor below, the living would look up and see dozens of these clay giants standing on narrow ledges, gazing down at them with painted eyes. They were a silent army of the dead, a constant looming reminder of lineage and claims to the land. In some areas, like the Laguna de los Condores, the Chachapoya built elaborate mausoleums on the cliffs, house-like structures filled with dozens of mummy bundles. When these were discovered, archaeologists found the bundles often had stylized faces stitched onto the outer cloth, giving the wrapped form a new eternal identity. The Chachapoya method was about presence. They didn't hide death. They elevated it. They placed their ancestors in the space belonging to the birds and the clouds, defying gravity and decay to ensure their protectors were always watching. Chapter 11. The Smoked Kin. In the dense, humid highlands of Papua New Guinea, among the Anga people living in the Aseki region, the challenge of preservation was immense. The tropical climate is an accelerator of decomposition. A body buried in the wet earth would become a skeleton in weeks. Yet the Anga possessed a deep cultural need to keep their kin close, refusing to let them disappear into the sodden ground. Their solution was practical, visceral, and intensely communal. They smoked their dead. This was not a practice for an ancient, vanished civilization. It continued well into the 20th century and is remembered vividly by living elders. When a respected member of the village died, a warrior, a leader, or a beloved mother, the process began immediately. The village would gather. The atmosphere was a mix of intense grief and necessary, almost industrial activity. The body was first prepared by making incisions in the feet, hands, and joints. The primary goal was to drain the fluids, the agents of rot. The most confronting part of the ritual for outsiders involved the collection of these fluids. The body was sometimes placed over a fire in the early stages, and as the skin blistered and broke, the fats and water dripping down were collected in bamboo tubes. This fluid was considered sacred, carrying the strength and essence of the deceased. In some Anga traditions, this fluid was rubbed onto the bodies of young male relatives to transfer the elder's power to the new generation. Once drained, the long process of smoking began. The body was placed in a seated, flexed position in a specially constructed smoking hut. A slow, smoky fire burned beneath it for weeks, sometimes over a month. The family members would take turns tending the fire, never letting it go out, never leaving the relative alone in the smoke. The smoke acted as a tanning agent. The phenols and formaldehyde in the wood smoke penetrated the skin and tissues, killing bacteria and curing the flesh like leather. The skin turned a deep, rich reddish brown, hardening into a durable shell. The internal organs desiccated inside the body cavity. Care was taken to preserve the face. Sometimes the mouth was sewn shut to prevent the jaw from dropping, and clay might be pasted over the eyes. The result was a lightweight, rigid, leathery mummy that retained the likeness of the person. Once fully cured, these bodies were not buried. They were dressed in their traditional finery, shell necklaces, feather headdresses, and grass skirts, and taken to a cliff overhang or a shallow cave shelter near the village. There, they were placed in a sitting position, looking out over their ancestral lands. These cliff shelters became galleries of the dead. Dozens of red-brown bodies, some generations old, sat together in the shade. They were still part of the community. People would visit them, talk to them, and perhaps ask for their guidance. The Anga had found a way to use fire and smoke to defy the wet rot of the jungle, turning their loved ones into enduring, leathery sentinels that remained physically present in their daily lives. Chapter 12. The Bog's Dark Embrace. Throughout northern Europe, in Ireland, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, the peat bogs hold a dark secret. For centuries, people cutting peat for fuel would occasionally slice into something that was not dense, decayed vegetation, but leather skin and red hair. These are the bog bodies, and they represent perhaps the most unsettling form of preservation, one that is likely accidental in its chemistry, but intentional in its violence. The peat bogs are unique chemical environments. They are wetlands filled with decaying sphagnum moss. The water beneath the surface is cold, highly acidic, and crucially anaerobic, completely devoid of oxygen. It is a natural pickling jar. When a body is placed into a bog, the normal process of decay cannot begin. The bacteria that break down human tissue need oxygen to thrive. Instead, the acid in the water, along with a compound called sphagnum released by the moss, begins to tan the body. The skin, muscles, and intestines are cured, turning into a tough, dark leather. Hair often turns a brilliant, fiery red due to the chemical interaction. However, the acid dissolves calcium phosphate. The result is that while the skin and organs are perfectly preserved, down to the stubble on a man's chin or the calluses on his feet, the bones inside demineralize and become soft, like pliable rubber. A bog body is a limp, leathery sack that retains the perfect outer form of a human being. The most famous of these, like Tolland Man discovered in Denmark, are hauntingly peaceful. He appears to be sleeping, a gentle expression on his face, or wearing only a sheepskin cap and a leather belt. You can count the wrinkles around his eyes. But the peaceful expressions belie the violence of their ends. Tolland Man, despite his serene face, has a braided leather noose drawn tight around his neck. He was hanged. Almost all bog bodies from the Iron Age show signs of extreme violence. Some were stabbed repeatedly, others bludgeoned over the head. Many were strangled or had their throats cut. They were often pinned down into the bog using wooden stakes or woven wicker hurdles, as if their captors were terrified they might rise again. The prevailing theory is that these were not simple burials. The bog was a liminal space, a boundary between the world of the land and the watery underworld. These people were sacrifices to the gods of the bog, perhaps to ensure fertility, military victory, or to appease angry spirits during hard times. Some may have been criminals executed and cast into the abyss. The creepiness of the bog bodies lies in their incredible detail, combined with the knowledge of their violent end. We can examine the contents of their stomachs. The last meal of Tulan man was a porridge of barley and wild seeds, knowing that hours later they were ritually murdered and sunk into the black water. The bog preserved the evidence of the crime perfectly for 2,000 years, holding the victims in a dark, cold embrace, waiting for us to look into their leathery faces. Chapter 13. The Cave of the Sleeping Dead. Isolated in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa, the Guanche people of the Canary Islands developed a unique culture completely cut off from the mainlands for over a millennium before the arrival of European explorers. In their isolation, they too developed an obsession with preserving their elite dead, creating mummies known as Zaxos. The Guanche society was hierarchical, ruled by kings called mentes. When a mense or a high-ranking noble died, their body was handed over to a specialized class of embalmers. Crucially, these embalmers were considered unclean. They lived on the fringes of society, and the embalming was performed by those of the same sex as the deceased to maintain purity. The process was a mix of desiccation and herbal stuffing, performed on a special stone table. Unlike the Egyptians, the Guanches did not always remove the internal organs. Instead, they often made incisions in the abdomen, chest, and sometimes the arms and legs, and thoroughly washed the cavities with salt water and vegetable juices. They then packed the body with a mixture of potent local ingredients. They used goat butter, pine resin, crushed pumice stone, and a variety of aromatic and astringent herbs like sage and lavender that grew on the volcanic slopes of the islands. This stuffing acted to dry out the tissues from the inside and mask the smell of decay. Once stuffed, the body was prepared for drying. The Guanches utilized the intense sun of their latitude. The body was laid out in the sun by day and smoked over low fires by night. This cycle of heating, drying, and smoking went on for weeks until the corpse was light, dry, and rigid. During this process, the skin would darken, turning a deep brown, almost black. The features became sharp and drawn. Once the drying was complete, the mummy was wrapped. The Guanches used finely tanned goat or sheep skins painstakingly sewn together to create a tight-fitting shroud that encased the entire body. Some high-ranking mummies were wrapped in as many as 15 layers of these soft skins marked with geometric designs. The final resting places of the Zaxos were secret. The Guanches used the intricate network of lava tubes and volcanic caves that riddled their islands. The mummies were taken deep into these cool, dry caves, often located on inaccessible cliff faces. They were placed on wooden planks or stone beds, sometimes leaning against the cave walls. When early European explorers found these caves, they were astonished to find hundreds of mummies standing or lying in the darkness, perfectly preserved by the Guanche techniques and the stable cave environment. They were the silent, sleeping ancestors, hidden away in the volcanic heart of their island home, protected by obscurity, until the outside world broke in. Chapter 14, The Display of the Saints. As we move closer to the modern era, the motivation for preservation shifts again. In Catholic Europe, particularly in Italy, a macabre tradition emerged from the 16th to the 19th centuries that moved the dead from hidden tombs into public spaces. This was the era of the catacombs, most famously exemplified by the Capuchin catacombs of Palermo in Sicily. Here, preservation was not about ancient magic or pagan sacrifice. It was about religious devotion, the remembrance of the dead, and a stark memento mori, a reminder of mortality for the living. It began simply. The Capuchin monks originally buried their dead brethren in a mass grave, but when they exhumed some bodies to make room for newcomers, they found them remarkably intact, naturally mummified by the cool, dry soil under their monastery. As seeing this as a sign from God, they decided to display these preserved brothers. They excavated crypts beneath the monastery, and soon it wasn't just for monks. The wealthy families of Palermo began to pay handsomely to have their relatives preserved and displayed in the catacombs. It became a status symbol to have a place in these subterranean halls. The preservation technique was relatively simple compared to ancient methods. The bodies were taken to strainer rooms, small chambers with terracotta pipes in the floor. The bodies were laid on slats over these pipes for about 8 months. The bodily fluids would slowly drip out and drain away while the dry, cool air of the crypts desiccated the flesh. Once dried into leathery husks, the bodies were taken out and washed with vinegar. Some might be stuffed with straw or bay leaves to hold their shape. Then came the most unsettling part. They were dressed. The families would provide the deceased's best clothing. Men were dressed in fine suits, military uniforms, or priestly vestments. Women were dressed in flowing silk gowns and bonnets, children in their Sunday best. The bodies were then arranged in the corridors of the catacombs. They were not hidden inside coffins. They were stood up in niches along the walls, hung from hooks by their necks, or laid in open caskets. They were grouped by social status and profession: a hallway for priests, another for professionals like doctors and lawyers, a chapel for virgins, a room for children. Entering the catacombs of Palermo is an overwhelming sensory experience. Thousands of clothed corpses stare down at you from the walls. Their skin is brown and parchment-like, pulled tight over skulls that grin hideously. Some still have hair and mustaches. Others are slowly crumbling to dust inside their rotting finery. Their clothes hang loosely on their shrunken frames. Families would visit their relatives on feast days. They would come down into the crypts to pray in front of the dried husk of their grandfather, perhaps even changing his clothes if the old ones had decayed too much. It was a way of keeping the dead within the social fabric, a refusal to let them go, resulting in a subterranean theater of the macabre where the dead stand in eternal, silent assembly, wearing the costumes of their vanished lives. Chapter 15. The Endless Echo. We have journeyed across continents and millennia, standing over the shoulders of Chinchorro butchers on the Atacama coast, smelling the natron and incense of the Egyptian Wabet, peering into the icy tombs of Scythian lords, and walking the silent halls of the Palermo catacombs. What unites these disparate cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, is a single universal terror: the terror of annihilation. The human mind capable of abstract thought and deep love, cannot reconcile itself with the biological reality that the vibrant thinking person they knew is now just slowly rotting meat. The creepy ways they preserve the dead, the flaying, the hooking of brains, the stuffing with herbs, the smoking over fires, the pickling in brine, were all desperate, ingenious attempts to solve an insoluble problem. They were battles fought against entropy. Every incision was an act of defiance. Every layer of linen was a shield against oblivion. Every jade suit and golden mask was a fortress built around the fragile hope that if the physical form could be saved, the essence of the person would not entirely vanish. We moderns look back at these practices with a mixture of horror and fascination. We see the grotesque, the macabre. We shudder at the thought of handling the viscera of our kin. We have sterilized death, hidden it in hospitals and stainless steel morgues, burned it in crematoriums to clean ash, or buried it quickly in sealed caskets under manicured lawns. We try to ignore the physical reality that the ancients confronted head-on. Yet the impulse has not died. It has merely changed form. What are cryonics? The freezing of heads or bodies in liquid nitrogen in the hope of future revival, if not the modern equivalent of the Scythian ice tombs. What is plastination? Replacing body fluids with polymers to create durable anatomical specimens, if not a high-tech version of the Chinchorro clay reconstructions? We are still trying to cheat the grave. We are still stuffing the void with our best technology, hoping it will be enough. In the end, the ancient mummies are not just creepy artifacts in museum cases. They are mirrors. When we look into the leathery face of Tolland man or stare into the painted eyes of an Egyptian coffin, we are seeing the profound, heartbreaking stubbornness of humanity. We are seeing the lengths to which love, fear, and spiritual desperation will drive us in our refusal to let go. The dead may crumble, but the desire to keep them remains the most enduring human trait of all, an endless echo raging against the dying of the light.